Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Ulrich, and I'm the director of NYU Washington, D.C. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Abramson Family Auditorium for today's program, Key Threats to Global Security and Cooperation. A special welcome to the Right Honourable Gordon Brown. This is Mr. Brown's fourth visit to NYU Washington, D.C., and as always, we are honored by your presence. I'm delighted to introduce you to our moderator this afternoon, Diane C. She is the executive director of the Sheikh Mohamed bin Zayed program at NYU Abu Dhabi, one of the 3 degree-granting campuses within NYU's Global Network University. From 2012 to 2015, she was deputy president at NYU, a member of the president's top decision-making team, and a key advisor with trustees, deans, faculty, administrators, and of course, our students. She previously served for 10 years as chief of staff and deputy president of NYU. Since 2002, she has taught a leadership class at NYU New York, and since 2014 has taught a public speaking and leadership course at NYU Shanghai. Before coming to NYU, she was a managing counsel at a Fortune 250 company, general counsel for the State Bar of California, White House Fellow, and California Superior Court Commissioner. She attended Oberlin College for her BA and UC Berkeley for her law degree. Her board memberships include Oberlin College, the Association of Governing Boards, American Management Association, the Soho Repertory Theater, the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and the Diversity Advisory Board for KPMG. She has served as president of the White House Fellows Foundation and Association, chaired the American Bar Association's Commission on Women in the Profession, and the ABA section of Legal Education and Admissions to the Bar. Her numerous awards include the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association's Trailblazer Award, that's a big, long one, Women's Leadership Award from the Asian American Bar Association of New York, Missouri Women Justice Award, 10 Outstanding Young Women of America, and an honorary doctorate from City University of New York. Please join me in welcoming Diane.
I know after that very gracious introduction, you were expecting someone a lot taller. Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful to be here at the DC campus of NYU, and it's a particular pleasure to be here to introduce and later moderate the Q&A session for an extraordinary person, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown. He is truly a Renaissance man who has expertise in so many fields. It just is extraordinary. He served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2007 to 2010 and was leader of the Labour Party at the time. During his tenure as Prime Minister, it happened to coincide with the global financial crisis, and he was one of the very earliest leaders to call out for global action to deal with that crisis. He recommended and advanced many measures in the UK to bring about fiscal stability and reform. And at the April 2009 G20 summit, he called upon the world leaders to commit to global action to respond to the crisis. And he received from them understandings and commitments for $1.1 trillion worth of aid worldwide to help restore order in the world's financial markets. He also was available as the financial expert that he was to advise his own country and the rest of the world in countless ways to help minimize the danger from this particular area, and the reforms that he brought about in his own country helped lead to more credit growth and jobs in this country. He pledged to strengthen the financial markets and regulation, and again, achieved that through global cooperation. Previously, he's been a member of the Parliament from 1983 to 2015. He was Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is their finance minister. He was the longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer in modern UK times. And during his time there, he helped bring about great reforms and improvements to the monetary and fiscal policies of Great Britain. He also helped sustain funding for many important initiatives such as health, education, and overseas aid. His experiences during the financial crisis convinced him that global cooperation and action, that collective action, really was the only way to deal with a number of problems confronting the world. He wrote a book, Beyond the Crash, Overcoming the First Crisis of Globalization, which reflects much of his thinking and insights about understanding how the international community could come together to prevent future shocks to the system. His time in government also shaped his views on the absolute critical importance of education as a driver for economic change and advancement, and he was committed and is committed to the notion that every child deserves an education. He now has been appointed the chair of the new Global Commission on Financing Global Education, and he's a passionate advocate worldwide, traveling constantly to speak out on behalf of educational opportunities for all. He has a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh, and he began his career as a lecturer. Since leaving government, he's been active in a host of other areas. He was named the UN Special Envoy for Education. He's chaired the Global Citizenship Commission, which NYU has been very proud to help sponsor. And he has been active in the World Economic Forum, where he now chairs the Global Strategic Infrastructure Initiative for the World Economic Forum. He served also, and we're proud of this, as NYU's inaugural Distinguished Global Leader in Residence, and he's had that status since 2010. He's spoken at this campus numerous times in Abu Dhabi, in New York, and in London, and in Florence. He has a wife active in charity activities, Sarah Brown, and 2 children. And as I said, he's just been an indefatigable champion for better understanding, better cooperation internationally, education for all, better reforms to fiscal and monetary systems, and better government overall. So he is truly a man of great stature, of great substance, of great insight, and he graces us with his presence today. Thank you, Gordon Brown.
Thank you very much. Can I say, first of all, what a real pleasure it is to be in Washington at the NYU campus here again. And once again, to be able to congratulate New York University, the first global network university, a university that thinks of itself as working in every continent and not just one, a university that is bringing in people from every part of the world to all its campuses, the university that has actually led the way in this idea that in a global society, every young person in every continent should be able to aspire to educational opportunities at a university like this. So it's always a pleasure to be with New York University. It's a particular pleasure to be in Washington during the IMF and World Bank meetings, some of which I'm attending. And I want to thank you for giving up your time at lunchtime when perhaps you might prefer to be eating rather than listening to speeches. I was, as Diane rightly said, a university lecturer at one stage in my life. And as you know, universities stand for integrity, objectivity, impartiality, the pursuit of truth, the search for knowledge, all the qualities I had to leave behind when I went into politics. I'm talking today about global security and global cooperation. And I'm reminding myself that one of the great figures of the 20th century, Albert Einstein, used to publish a book every year on themes around global security and cooperation after he finished his Nobel Prize-winning work as a physicist. And so he used to publish a book either about global security or global cooperation or global justice. And then he would go on a book tour around Europe to promote this book. And he would come around Britain, my country, and what he would do is he would do 3 or 4 meetings every night, traveling round with just him and his chauffeur in a car. The distances are so small in Britain, you can cover many meetings. So in the course of 10 to 12 days, he'd have done 50 meetings. The only problem was he gave exactly the same speech wherever he went. And one night, his chauffeur, who was traveling with him all the time, said to Einstein, "You're an old man, Mr. Einstein. You're looking very tired. I've been sitting in the audience in the front row listening to your speech every night, every time you give it, 4 times a night. I've memorized it by heart. What about you taking a rest and sitting in the audience, and I'll give the speech?" And so the chauffeur was allowed on this occasion to come up to the front of the stage and give the speech with Einstein sitting in the audience. And he did it brilliantly because it was a 15-minute speech. He said exactly the things that Einstein had said. It was so memorized and rote that he managed to deliver it almost word for word. And then he sat down to applause. And just as he was getting up to leave the stage, the chairman of the night said, "Are there any questions?" And so the chauffeur is standing there, rooted to the spot, as the first question, of course, came, Mr. Einstein, what is the relationship between the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics? And the chauffeur's rooted to the spot, unable to think of what to say, and then suddenly he hits on it. And he says, pointing at the guy sitting in the front row, "Ladies and gentlemen, this question is so simple and straightforward. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to come up and answer the question." Now, my theme is perhaps a little different from the one that Einstein would have had 50 years ago. My theme is actually taken from John F. Kennedy, your great president, who was tragically assassinated in 1963. And my theme today is interdependence. How, for 200 years, as John F. Kennedy said, we were a world where we thought of ourselves as asserting our independence as states. And the colonial movement to get rid of British control, America was very successful in getting rid of us, the British, you remember. I don't quite know why you now are the people that like our monarchy most of all, because they caused you the greatest problem in the 18th century. But independence was the theme for the colonial movements in the 19th and 20th century that broke away from imperialism. But Kennedy said the new theme of our generation is interdependence. You may remember his reading his great inaugural address in 1961, and there was these wonderful phrases in his address, the torch has passed to a new generation, all about young people now taking control of the post-war world. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Remember that great phrase that you're taught at school, I think, but in almost every place, about the commitment to public service. Never negotiate from fear, never fear to negotiate, about the importance of diplomacy and public service in the modern world as opposed to resorting to confrontation and conflict. I'm told that Richard Nixon was asked which of these great Kennedy phrases in any part of the speech would you like to have given if you were giving that inaugural address? And Nixon said, there was only one phrase I wanted to give. I hereby accept the office of President of the United States, which he was denied for 8 years in giving. But Kennedy said in that speech, he said, ask not what Americans can do for ourselves, ask what we together can do for the freedom of the world. And then in 1962, he made this amazing speech, which is worth reading, in Philadelphia, the home of the Independence Declaration, in which he said, it's time now not to have just a declaration of independence, it's time for a declaration of interdependence. And the individual liberty of each of us has got to be balanced against the indivisible liberties of us all. And he went on to propose cooperation between the great countries of the world and the continents, Europe and America in particular, to attack world poverty, to bring about nuclear and other disarmament, to deal with the problems that arose from a world which was fractured and divided. And this vision of interdependence makes more sense now in a world which is increasingly one where the connections, both through the internet, but also through trade, through the global flow of goods and services, the global flow of people, makes us interconnected, each one with the other. And it raises fundamental questions about our security and our ability to cooperate for common purposes, which is the theme of the remarks I want to make. So look at the world today. A dangerous world, more dangerous than 10 years ago, more unstable, more uncertain in our futures. People would agree that there is greater insecurities. Whatever way you count it, there are more conflicts now than there were 10 years ago. And at the end of the Cold War, probably 40 conflicts, if you define it by the numbers of people whose lives are put at risk every year. Conflicts, of course, that have led to massive losses of life, particularly in Syria, but also in Iraq. We see it in parts of Africa. We see it on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan. We see it in Myanmar, where there's a huge refugee problem and persecution of minorities in these countries. And if you look at what has happened over these last few years, some people say there are only 12 countries in the world of the 194 or 5 countries that are registered at the United Nations who are not involved in some kind of military intervention or affected militarily by what is happening in the world. It looks like a world where, for all the hopes of the end of the Cold War, that we would get rid of conflict. Some people even talked about the end of history. It is a more insecure world than now. And even countries that claim to be neutral, like Switzerland, are actually some of the biggest arms sales sellers in the world, and therefore all are drawn in to this insecure world. And what has it produced? It has produced the biggest movement of people displaced from their homes at any time since the Second World War. And while we talk about Syria, and I will say something about it in a minute, 12 million displaced people from Syria alone, about a third of the country. 4 million living in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. 1 million having tried one way or another to get to Europe and to other places beyond their region. The Syrian numbers are big, but the total numbers are 60 million people now displaced, the size of the population of the United Kingdom. 30 million of them children, many of whom will have no chance ever to get to school as a result of the failure to deliver education in emergencies. And of these 60 million people displaced around the world, there are about 20 million refugees who are now traveling the world looking for a home and unable in some cases to be accepted in the places where they arrive. And so we have got conflict, and we've got displacement, and we've got this huge refugee problem that is becoming bigger every year in recent years without us seemingly able to do something about it. And on top of that, and the security issues arise from this, of course, you've got a resumption of some aspects of the Cold War with the aggression of Russia in Ukraine. You've got China's desire to be a regional power in Asia. And whether it is because we've had the end to the Cold War and we've had a unipolar era, which is now a multipolar era, people's senses that the world is a more insecure place than it was. But perhaps more than that, they do not see a way out of this insecurity. They do not see what the architecture of the future that would protect peace and stability is likely to be, and it causes greater insecurity as a result. But there's another issue that I think is a security issue, but also the product of this global era, which makes us more interdependent, but also makes us more insecure. And that is the movement of people generally. Because if you look at globalization, you might define it as the global flow of capital and the global flow of goods and services. So 50 years ago, capital was mainly mobilized at a national level. People invested in their own industries, in their own areas. It is now mobilized at a global level. 50 years ago, most of the things you bought in the shops that you entered, probably in streets rather than on the internet, of course, you bought from domestic producers. And now most of the goods, computers, textiles, clothes, electronic goods, are going to be made, assembled, sometimes in a number of different countries to produce the same good under what's called vertical specialization, or what you might also call the trade in tasks. But of course, a corollary of the global flow of goods, services, and capital is people ask, well, what about the global flow of people? How can you restrict the flow of people if you're allowing the flow of capital and goods and services? And so today there are about 230 million people who are living in the country that is not the country of their birth. It is only 3% of the world's population, but it is a rising figure. And what's particularly a rising figure is the number of people trying to move from poor countries to rich countries. And if you find out, if you're in the middle of Nigeria, that you can double your wages by going from one rural part of Nigeria, if you're a construction worker, to Lagos or to Abuja, but then find if you're in Lagos and Abuja, you can increase your wages for doing the same kind of job in construction 6 times by moving to London or to Dublin or to New York, then if people start to realize that you're better off, even if you're poor in a rich country, than if you were rich in a poor country, the pressures for mobility grow. And therefore the world becomes more uncertain as people worry about the numbers of migrants, but also the numbers of illegal migrants, people who are in countries without permission to be there. And there are various estimates, but if you think of America having an estimate of 11 million illegal immigrants unlawfully here, unregistered at least, then take India, a country where they probably would say the figure is anything between 30, 40, or 50 million people who have moved from other parts of Asia in particular into India but are unregistered. And this all leads to another aspect of the security issues that we're facing, and that is protectionism. Because people see that globalization brings opportunity, but they also see it brings insecurity. And it leads to people to protest against global change and to look for people to shelter or to insulate or to protect them, at least cushion them against the changes that are happening around them. And if they feel their job is being lost through unfair competition from China or Asia, if they feel their industry is being torn apart because other countries' industries are dumping goods in your own country, if they feel anyway, whatever the cause, that they're losing out because their job is being squeezed by technology, but they blame it on foreign competition, then the protectionist attitudes that have grown will continue to grow in the years to come. So when people talk about what's happening in the United States, you've got quite an interesting presidential debate at the moment. Mr. Trump, by the way, has a Scottish mother, and so do I. If you think about this debate, then it is not unique to America. Right across Europe, exactly the same things are happening, where people are reacting against the changes that they feel are unfair, the squeezing of the middle classes, they see it, the fact that traditional occupations, from clerks to secretaries to draftsmen, right across the board, typists, jobs that were taken for granted 50 years ago or 20 years ago are now changing out of all recognition, and people are looking for something or someone to say that they have an answer by somehow bringing control back home. A globalization that looks like a runaway train, out of control and uncontrollable, and people say, well, the answer is, let's find someone who can show me how we can bring control back home. I was in Washington a few years ago, and there was huge demonstrations against globalization when I was chairing meetings of the International Monetary Fund. And outside, there were all these banners there. And one of them I've never forgotten because it sums up, I think, people's attitudes to this changing world. Worldwide campaign, it said, against globalization. Now, you can see what people meant and what they were trying to communicate. But this is the paradox of our time, that people understand in many ways that the world is becoming more interconnected, but they want somehow to bring control back home. So here we have a world of greater conflict. Some of these conflicts are about religion. Some of these conflicts are about ethnic tensions. Some of these conflicts arise from climate change and the droughts and the pressures on resources that then lead to conflicting parties. Some of the results, of course, lead to deaths in war. But generally, you've got this sense in some parts of the world that coexistence is impossible between the two religions or the different religions of the world. And you're dealing with problems that some people then say represent a culture war. But there is another aspect of this, and this is what I want to draw out, that I think leads us to think there's got to be a better way of solving our problems and solving these problems that I've just talked about. Some of the problems we now face are global problems that cannot be solved without global coordinated action. We found that in climate change, didn't we, when we had the Copenhagen and then the Paris discussions. If one country can pollute another country and be a free rider by taking no action in its own right to deal with the problem, and then the world is worse as a result of that, then we all lose. And because pollution knows no borders, we've got to find some way of bringing countries together so that they take action that is in everybody's interest, but they're all prepared to make concessions for a common policy. So climate change is a global problem. It's not just a common problem. It is a problem that cannot be resolved other than by a better way of coordinating international or cross-national action. We found this also with financial stability. During the financial crisis that Diane rightly mentioned was a very big feature of the time I was Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, we realized that we could not solve the problem of the banking sector simply by Britain doing something. And America couldn't solve it by America doing something, and France and Germany and so on couldn't solve it just by acting on their own. because these banks were international institutions. They were connected across frontiers. There was a huge shadow banking system in operation that was based around a whole series of different places of location. As one banker told me just as his bank was going under, he said, "I'm just beginning to understand the risks I have been taking." I thought it was a bit late. And one of the banks that collapsed, the night before it collapsed, the head of the bank, I was talking to him, and he said, "All we need," he said, "is overnight finance." Well, his bank collapsed in the biggest crash that any British bank has ever faced the next morning. And it wasn't overnight finance he needed complete restructuring, which is still ongoing as a result of it. But we found out in the financial crisis that unless there were global standards and global rules, unless there was a common approach to the capitalization of banks and the holding of equity and reporting standards that we had in common, then confidence in the banking system could not work. And so we had now financial stability is a global issue. It's a global problem that needs global solutions. Migration, and I'll come to this at the end when I'm talking about what we can do about it. Again, no one country can deal with this problem on its own. There are now 65 walls that are being built or have been built. So you've got about 190-something countries in the world. A third of them have got walls of one way or another, separating them off from a neighboring country. And this is the numbers of walls and barriers and fences has been rising very quickly over the last few years. If you take even the last few months in Europe, Hungary and other countries in Eastern Europe putting up their own fences to prevent people coming in and out of the country. And so migration is a problem that you can try putting up a wall, but it doesn't seem to prevent people being able to get into your country. And it doesn't deal with the problem that is putting pressure on your country that usually arises in another area of the world. So the problems that Europe face now cannot be solved without something happening in the Middle East. It cannot therefore be solved without coordinated action. The problems of the future, I mean, Africa is a continent of 1 billion people, but soon it'll be 2.5 billion people, 5 times the size of Europe, people wanting to search for prosperity, moving in and out of Africa, but mainly out of Africa in search of new jobs. You cannot solve this problem without international cooperation or coordination, and either, of course, people are going to become more prosperous in Africa, or they are going to seek to become prosperous by moving to other countries in very big numbers. And some of you may have seen a survey that was done. If there are 230 million people living in the country that is not the country of their birth at the moment, how many people actually would prefer to move to another country, mainly a richer country? One of the big Gallup surveys suggests that the figure is something like 650 million people, 3 times as many as are in countries that are not of their birth, wanting to move. Many of them, of course, as you will rightly find out when you look at the statistics, wanting to move to the United States of America in search of a better life. And so migration, the problems raised by it, why people feel that they have to migrate, you cannot solve them either just in the host country or just in the country from where people are leaving. You've got to have an international and coordinated approach to it. Climate change, financial stability, the question of migration. Let me just deal with another problem that's come up in the last few days. We've known about for some time, but it's not something that people have really spent a great deal of time addressing. How you deal with the inequalities in the world when there is so much tax avoidance and tax evasion. So countries are estimated at the moment to be losing $7 trillion in revenues that they should be receiving from people who, if they paid their fair share and their rightful share of tax in their own country, would be contributing to your public services in America or Britain or Europe generally, or around the world. In Europe alone, it's estimated $1 trillion is being lost through tax avoidance because that is money that is going out of the country, usually to tax havens like Panama or Cayman Islands, but money that's escaping the tax authorities and is therefore a cost to you as an individual because you are paying your fair share of taxes and other people are not. And the public services that are being financed by taxation, whether it's defense or transport or healthcare, or social security, are being deprived of these resources. But how do you solve this problem? You can issue a unilateral declaration that everybody should pay tax in your own country. But you can't make it stick unless you have cooperation around the world. And you can't make it stick, actually, unless you have cooperation amongst the least compliant authorities. Because if people can move from one authority to another and eventually find themselves in the authority that is least compliant and least willing to be cooperative in dealing with these problems, then of course you still are losing your revenue. And so it's really interesting how governments have tried to deal with these problems. So I was a member of the European Council as a finance minister in the early years of this century. And so the Europeans, all of them, that was 15 countries at the time, were getting really fed up about the amount of tax avoidance, money going to Luxembourg. Austria was another country where there were tax conditions that made it easy to avoid tax. So if you were a German, you put your money in a Luxembourg bank. The authorities in Germany never knew anything about it. You traveled across by car because it's easy to do so every year, picked up your dividends. The Luxembourg banks pledged to secrecy. The German authorities never knew. And you had a savings income that was depriving the German government of taxation. So what did Germany say? Well, why don't we just do this? 15 countries in Europe, let's all have the same savings tax. And let's force Luxembourg, as well as Britain, or these other countries, to charge a savings tax at 25%. And then everybody will have to pay the same rate of tax. There'll be no incentive for people to move their money into Luxembourg anymore, and therefore everything will be okay. So they proposed a harmonized saving tax right across Europe, 500 million people covered by it. And that was to solve the problem, except this, that the minute people realized they couldn't put the money into Luxembourg, they'd put it into Liechtenstein or into Switzerland, or if you wanted to go further, into Hong Kong. And so unless you could bring the other tax authorities into your savings tax, then you were going to see the amounts of money you wanted to receive avoided through easy tax avoidance mechanisms. And so the answer could not be that you were going to be able to persuade Liechtenstein, Switzerland, America, Hong Kong, all countries in the world, the Cayman Islands, Panama, all to have the same 25% savings tax. That was impossible. So you had to have another way of solving the problem, but it demanded that there be international cooperation. And so the answer, of course, has been to require exchange of information. So if one authority has an American citizen resident in that place, then they have a duty to report the income that you are receiving, and the tax can then be charged either by them on behalf of America or by America itself. The problem, of course, is that it's very difficult to administer. You're dealing with millions of people around the world. It's a very complicated system, but it is the only way that you can actually get to the right revenues you need and expect from people not avoiding their taxes. And so there is no solution to the problem of inequality, which leads, of course, to the massive amount of tax, is causing the massive amount of inequality caused by tax avoidance. There's no solution without some form of international cooperation, and it cannot just be a few countries that you like to cooperate with and have a coalition of the willing, so to speak. You've got to bring in every country in the world, otherwise your weakest link will be that country that refuses to comply with your legislation. And so, again, when you actually look at the issues that arise from global change, and you look at the mobility of money, and you also look at the mobility of people, you're going to have to find a global solution to this problem. Terrorism, biggest problem that people worry about, and I've come to this through telling you about conflicts and also telling you about organizations and terrorist groups that want to claim the impossibility of coexistence. How can you deal with international terrorist groups without international cooperation? You can have the best security service in the world here in America. You can have the FBI and the CIA working brilliantly, but if you've got no cooperation from countries where terrorists are being harbored, or where they're planning their activities from, or where they're using for financing their terrorist activities with a tax haven address to launder money around the world, then you cannot solve the problem. So even the richest country, America, the biggest country in the world, now needs to build and be part of a system, an international architecture, where decisions can be made that are in your interests, but can only be made, as John F. Kennedy said in the 1960s, by a declaration of interdependence and building an architecture of cooperation around it. And before I finish, I just want then to say, well, what could you do to build a better system, a better architecture? What could you do to be able to solve some of the problems that worry us and think sometimes we can solve within our own national borders, but now know and realize when we think about it in detail, cannot be solved without international cooperation? Well, the first thing, obviously, is that the international economic institutions have got to be able to deal with the economic and financial stability problems that we face. So here we are in Washington with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They were built in 1945. They were for an age where there was not global movement of capital. They were for an age when there was very little mobility of labor at that time. Therefore, an age when there was very little trade between countries of the kind that now exists. There was no internet, and therefore there was no automatic exchange of money across frontiers in the way that we have now. These institutions are not fit for purpose for the modern era and would have to be revived and have to be modernized. The IMF should be a surveillance institution that reports on what countries are doing and holds them to account for failure to meet their own standards. The World Bank has got to be a more effective development institution that can deal with the problems of inequality and poverty. Climate change, we don't have an institution. We're lucky to have an agreement. We don't have a treaty. But if you think climate change is a problem, then to have no internationally coordinating mechanism for actually dealing with it and reporting year to year, other than through voluntary acts by individual countries, then you're not going to make much progress in dealing with the problem or creating renewable incentives for renewable industries or helping countries mitigate and adapt where they're hit by droughts or by other aspects of climate change. So you need that. And then finally, just to, what are you going to do about the refugee problem? Because it's not going away. And what are you going to do about migration? Because it is unlikely to be less in 10 years' time. It's likely to be far greater. If I'm saying that there are 230 million people live in countries that are not countries of their birth, and that's 3% of the population, if you return to the level of migration at the turn of the 19th to 20th century, it would be 10% of the people of the world, and that would be 7 to 8. That would be 700 to 800 million people who were staying in countries that are not of their birth. The biggest immediate problem is what our rights and responsibilities are to refugees. If you're a climate change refugee, in other words, you've been forced out of your country because of drought or because there are real problems that make your country's land or your country's resources not environmentally sustainable and you're forced out, you have no rights that are any as refugees. If you're a middle-income country and you're receiving refugees, you get no help at the moment of any great significance from the international institutions who concentrate historically only on low-income countries. You know, and I'm meeting the High Commissioner for Refugees actually this afternoon, that our system of dealing with refugees is based on voluntary contributions. So if you're doing a peacekeeping operation around the world, there's a system in the United Nations of assessed contributions, so the richest countries pay this and the poorest countries pay that. And some countries, of course, send their troops and charge for them so that they can make money out of being part of United Nations peacekeeping operations. But when it comes to humanitarian aid, the most immediate and urgent of aid that people need, faced with having no home and no food and no shelter, nothing for the children, no bank accounts, usually no identity cards, nothing that can actually make them demand rights in the country in which they find themselves. The system that we have for dealing with effectively 60 million displaced people and 20 million refugees depends on putting around a begging bowl every year. There is no way that the international community can continue to fund help for refugees and displaced people simply by voluntary contributions, because in the end we never raise enough money and we've got a rising population of refugees. And some people are now saying we need a new convention. The Convention of Refugees was 1951 in the wake of the war that had displaced large numbers of people in Europe. We need a new refugee convention for the future. What is absolutely clear is that we cannot go on with a situation without there being massive discontent, riots, and possibly terrorists able to exploit it. We cannot go on with the present system where we cannot provide for the numbers who are displaced and the numbers of refugees that we have. So how do I end this? By telling you one story. 1995, Rwanda. A terrible civil war. 1 million people died in only a period of a few days as ethnic tensions boiled over and children, mothers, all became victims of a terrible racial purge that was taking place. If you go to Rwanda, And if you go to what's called the Children's Museum in Rwanda, the museum of the genocide, where they try to remember what happened in the interest of reminding people that we should never let this happen again. There's a photograph of a child that I will never forget, a child called David, and there's a photograph of this young boy, and it says that he was 12 years old. It then says, favorite sport, football. Favorite hobby, making people laugh. Ambition, to be a doctor. Death by mutilation. Last words to his mother, the United Nations is coming to help us. And that young boy in the 1990s, in his complete innocence and his idealism, believed that when we made a promise that we would protect people who were suffering from genocide or torture or from crimes against humanity, that we would act to help that child. He believed us, and we failed him. And we were unable to prevent a mass loss of life in that country, yet we had accepted and given that young person an assurance that on humanitarian grounds we would do something about it. I say this because whether it's in Syria or Iraq, or whether it's in Burma, Myanmar, or whether it's on the border of Afghanistan, Pakistan, or whether it's in South Sudan, which I visited recently, which is again back in a civil war, or whether it's the Central African Republic or the DRC, and we're meeting the Prime Minister who's here today trying to recover from a civil war, but also Ebola and also other diseases that have afflicted their country. If we are going to solve some of these problems, we need to be an international community. We cannot avoid the fact that even if we said this has nothing to do with us, we are affected by this. What's changed in the world, as Kennedy recognized in the 1960s, is that we're interconnected, we're interdependent, we are integrated in a way we've never been before. And whether we try to do so or not, we are going to deal with the consequences of what happens in other countries. So it is better for us to think how we build an international architecture for decision making that allows us to deal with pollution, that prevents financial instability where we can, that does something about better growth, and I should have said something about growth and trade, that prevents those people who are the casualties through no fault of their own of wars or conflict, of environmental or natural disasters from being without help and without support. The challenge, I think, of this generation is to recognize that globalization is a fact, and we've got to manage it well or badly, but we cannot escape from it. The interdependence is a reality as much as independence is important to us. We have got to recognize our interdependence, and we've got to build a better system of decision making for our security, to deal with terrorism and the problems that arise from conflict, and to make sure that there is prosperity, because prosperity to be sustained in future is going to have to be shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gordon. I'm going to ask you one or two questions, and then we're going to ask the audience to propose some questions. So I hope we'll be thinking of some. I referred to the Global Citizenship Commission as an endeavor in which you're actively involved as chair. And on Monday, the Global Citizenship Commission will be presenting its report and findings to Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General at the UN. Your passion as a humanitarian and as someone who sees these global issues sort of led to the creation of this, which, as I indicated, NYU has been very happy to help support. And its aims are really to take a look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was produced in 1948 as one of the first major developments coming out of the relatively new UN. Our own Eleanor Roosevelt was heavily involved in making sure that that came into fruition and was adopted by the countries active in the UN at the time. But we were looking in this Global Citizenship Commission at the 21st century perspective and how human rights play a role, how they can sharpen the focus of people like you who are trying to look for solutions. Would you be able to comment a little bit on how that work of the Global Citizenship Commission ties in with these ideas on security and global cooperation?
Well, what's remarkable about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is Eleanor Roosevelt chaired this amazing group of people, and they produced what is almost a timeless document which asserts the rights of every individual, irrespective of nationality or religion or creed or race, irrespective of disability. All these things were asserted by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the 1940s. What is interesting, however, is it was a Cold War document in this sense, that they could agree on the basic rights that they enunciated. Some of them were political and civil rights, and some of them were social and economic rights. They could agree on what the rights were. They couldn't agree why they had decided on these rights. The Soviets believed there was some process of historical determinism at work, and they explained everything in that way. And so there was no agreement on why they'd agreed on these rights, and then there could be no agreement on what the implementation process was. No country at that time was prepared to surrender its sovereignty in a way that would allow there to be an international criminal court, for example, or that you would have rights that were imposed if national governments failed, like a responsibility to protect or a principle of humanitarian intervention. So we agreed on the rights, but we had no means by which these rights were protected or implemented. We relied, of course, as we continue to rely most of all on national governments, who then put a number of these proposals into the legislation. But what do you do when a national government does not uphold human rights? You cannot say that they have the right to define what these human rights are, irrespective of what happens to the population. You've got to find some basis on which you can help protect these rights, even when a state becomes a state that is run through tyranny or dictatorship, or through splitting or dividing the population, like under apartheid or under some of the most harsh regimes in the world. So what we looked at then was, what did they miss in 1948? Of course, there was little attention to the rights of women. There was little attention to the rights of children. There was little attention to rights that we now take for granted. Gay and lesbian rights are completely unmentioned. There was little attention, despite the fact that there was huge problems with refugees and people are seeking asylum, less attention than there should have been to that. So we have said, well, here's in these areas things that could be done to enhance the legitimate rights of all these people. And then we say, well, look, when there's a situation where there is torture or genocide being practiced by an individual country, like Rwanda, then you cannot have in the United Nations Security Council one country like Russia or China vetoing action that has got to be taken by the international community. Just because you're a big country, you cannot ignore the suppression of human rights, and you cannot ignore that there are issues where it may be right to intervene, but an individual country that wants to block it should not be able to do so. So we're recommending that the veto that 5 countries have be removed in certain instances where there are human rights abuses. We're recommending that there be a new convention on refugees that makes sure that their basic rights are upheld despite all the difficulties, understanding there's always got to be a balance between national security and the right of people to have protection as individuals. And we're making a number of recommendations actually about children, because children, there's no mention in 1948 of child marriage or child trafficking or child abuse, no child labor. All these problems that we now know still exist in many countries in the world, and we need a framework that protects children's rights, even when their governments are not prepared to take action themselves. So we have tried to update the Universal Declaration. We've tried to show where we could do things better. But again, the principle is, I think, the same, that the protection of the human rights of individuals now takes place in a world where we're all affected if we fail to take the actions that are necessary.
And those of you in the NYU system will be getting a notification. If you want to access the report on Monday, it will be available online, and we hope you take a look at it. You mentioned that you should have said more about growth and trade. Here's your chance. What would you say about growth and trade and its connections?
So why is the world economy growing so slowly? Why, since the recession in 2009, have we had one of the slowest recoveries? And why, in Europe, for example, are more than 10% of people unemployed? Why are we worried about a Chinese recession, or at least a Chinese slowdown in growth, a Chinese devaluation, the spread of it in the emerging markets? Why is the world more uncertain now, despite the fact that we're not in a recession and have supposedly come out of it. Why is there so much insecurity about what's happening in Brazil? We've got Russia. We've got slowdowns in other parts of the world. Is there a reason that that this has happened, and can we do better? And why, interestingly enough, is trade, which used to be the engine of growth? Every time that you read economics from Adam Smith onwards, trade is the engine of growth, the division of labor, the specialization of the product good. Why is trade growing so slowly? Why have we become more protectionist in our attitudes? Why do we worry so much about unfair trade practices, and why are exports from America not growing fast? And why is China worried it can't export to the rest of the world? Why are most of the rich countries unable to get exports into the new emerging market countries? So there's been a breakdown in cooperation, because if you think of it, it's in America's interest to export more to the rest of the world. It's in China's interest to be able to export more to the America or to the advanced economies. In fact, China needs to export to enable it to undergo this massive reform as it creates its middle class, a consumer-driven economy, innovation-driven, and moves from this sort of mass, low-paid manufacturing economy that depends on steel and heavy industry and textiles, but also electronics. But it pays relatively low wages to people in a country that wants to have a rising middle class. So the answer is that if you could have greater cooperation, if you could have a better balance between monetary, fiscal policy and structural reform, if, for example, America invested more in infrastructure, which it needs anyway, if Europe was able to expand fiscally because it's got 10% unemployment, if China was able also to maintain its domestic economy, but in a position as a result of the growth of the world economy to continue its exports, then everybody would benefit. So the issue is, why do we not cooperate more closely in devising economic policies that are to the benefit of each other? Why do we tend to think of economic policy purely in terms of what Britain's going to do, what America's going to do, what China's going to do, as if they are completely unconnected with each other when it comes to formulating economic policies that could be in the interests of each of them? And I think the Global Growth Pact that was suggested in 2009 after the end of the global recession should have been implemented. We would have had higher levels of growth. The IMF have calculated that there'd be 100 million more people, I think, in work. I think it's the latest figure. You'd have 1 or 2% higher growth. You would be better off in America, but China would also be better off, and so would Europe as a result. So the pattern of cooperation that we had at the time of the financial crisis broke down, and we've got very little coordinated action when you think of each country's problems in a low interest rate, a low inflation, low oil price environment. There's huge benefit to each of us deciding to cooperate on the basis of shared policy approaches that would make a difference to all of us.
I'd like to turn to the audience if some of you have questions. I understand there's some individuals with microphones that could run down. Does anyone have a question? Could you stand, and then he'll give you a mic there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown, for speaking to us. My name is Akash. I'm a student here at NYU. I have a question on global security, especially on the idea of interdependence. Many believe that there's an obligation for countries to help migrants and also tackle the countries that are causing this migration crisis, with people suffering under regimes and totalitarian regimes all around the world. We have tried military intervention, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, but, for example, those just led to worse consequences. And then there's a growing reluctance of many people in the world to further intervene or to further do things, saying that this is not our problem and that dictatorships are better than the anarchy that follows. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on, is stability a value in and of itself? And what is the tangible action that we should undertake with regard to our obligations to interdependence in countries like Syria?
Yeah, I think we mustn't think that the only alternative to military action is doing nothing. What the Middle East and North Africa in particular need is a comprehensive approach that would include us, America, Europe, in diplomatic initiatives, in using aid that we have to help stimulate certain aspects of their economy, economic incentives for them to develop modern economies and infrastructure for the future, and help with education that would allow us to show that this idea that coexistence is impossible is something that is completely wrong. So there is a middle way between doing nothing and invasion. And the middle way is developing an economic and social and diplomatic as well as military strategy for the region. The difference I see now, which is perhaps controversial, is that while America and Europe share the same interests, so we both want a stable Middle East, we both understand, as President Obama said in his State of the Union address, that these are economic and social problems where young people don't have opportunity, where there are huge issues about discrimination, where there is lack of infrastructure, not an entrepreneurial culture. All these things are problematical within the region. So while we have the same analysis and the same interests, now it's clear that the urgency with which Europe has to act to deal with these problems means that the priorities are in a sense different for Europe than for America. America is energy independent. It therefore doesn't need to worry as much about the Middle East as a source of energy and oil. America has pivoted towards Asia because of the desire to work out a better relationship with Asia because of the issues raised by China. And so Europe, however, has got millions of people potentially moving into Europe from Africa or from the Middle East as a result of a wave of migration, and therefore it's got immediate issues it's got to deal with. And as I say, either we help make people in the region richer, or they will feel, or at least many will feel, that the only way to become richer is to move to Europe, even if they do it illegally. And of course, Europe has got this immediate problem also on its doorstep of terrorism. And so while there have been many terrorist incidents in the United States since 9/11, there have been far more in Europe, and there are far more homegrown terrorists operating in Europe than in America, as far as all the information we have is. And therefore, the threat that Europe faces on its borders is more immediate, more urgent, more in need of action, and cannot be ignored. And you cannot take a long-term view only of the Middle East issues if you're sitting in Europe today. So you need a strategy for dealing with the problems of the region. You need better relationships between Europe, America, and that region. And you need also, of course, to be clear that if you have urgent priorities, you may need to act more quickly to deal with some of these issues, whether through aid or through diplomatic action, to try to build better relationships with these countries. The same problem is going to arise in relation to Africa in the years to come, because Africa is home to a large number of terrorist groups. It's got a huge youth population that is increasingly discontented about its prospects, because growth in Africa, while it's happened, has not done a huge amount to narrow the gap between Africa and the rest of the world. And again, Europe is on Africa's doorstep in a way that America is not. And it is almost certain that Europe will have to develop a more immediate set of relationships with Africa to enable it to deal with these, the flow of immigrants, the issues of terrorism. But of course, the biggest issue of all in these two continents, or the continent of Africa and the Middle East, is the large population of young people. So Africa will be home to nearly half of the world's young people at one stage. And in the Middle East and North Africa, you've probably got 200 million young people growing up in the region, many of whom have got no opportunities for education or for employment. And while hard power could deal with the hard core of terrorist groups, hard power cannot deal with the discontents of 200 million young people. You've got to have a different strategy for dealing with that. So, as I say, there is a middle way between doing nothing and military action.
Okay. Another question? Okay. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Saskia Miller. I'm a social and tech entrepreneur. And I was curious about the new system that you're proposing of global cooperation. Is it an improvement to the UN, or a completely new system or organization that's global? And the second part of my question pertains to global citizens, everyday people that might be able to contribute in intellectual or material ways to solving global problems. Can you envision a new way for everyday citizens to participate in this
Yeah, these are fascinating questions. I mean, the thing about the architecture of decision-making in a more integrated world is that there is no one institution that is going to cover economic, environmental, diplomatic, trade, and economic issues. So you've got a number of different institutions with different levels of competence and different levels of authority. There are only 2 institutions in the world that have got the exclusive right, if you like, irrespective of what nation state says, to penalize people or to take direct action that is not referred to the nation states for approval. And that is the World Trade Organization, that could fine countries that act in a protectionist way without recourse to any vote by its member bodies. And you've got the International Criminal Court, to which America is actually not signed up. But the International Criminal Court, as we found in relation to Yugoslavia, is in a position to try people and punish people where there are crimes against humanity. But you've got if you like, a mixed economy of organizations. And I was explaining that if you want the economic organizations, the IMF and the World Bank, to work better, then you've got to recognize that they were built for another era. The World Trade Organization is a one-member, one-vote organization, but it has failed to deliver a trade deal. The first time in 70 years we cannot get an agreement on trade because of all these problems that I said about protectionism arising from people's insecurity. Then you've got the United Nations itself, and its ability to act, of course, is dependent on the Security Council, which allows each of the 5 main countries, China, America, France, Britain, it allows them to veto. And so it has an inbuilt, if you like, break on its ability to act. And that's why we're recommending in certain circumstances like crimes against humanity, can you really justify a big country vetoing action that is thought to be necessary to protect the individual liberties or freedoms of people who are facing crimes against humanity. So there's going to be a sort of multiplicity of institutions. Each should have its own remit that makes sense of what it's being charged to do, and each should be updated every period of time. But you're not going to have one institution that is global government. You're going to have a system of, or a network of institutions that have their own particular responsibilities. The challenge at the moment has been to create an environmental organization that is in a position to monitor properly what's happening across the world on climate change. But your point about citizenship is incredibly important, because what's changed in these last 20 or 30 years is that you now have an educated citizenship that is able to communicate with each other across the international media in a way that could never have happened before. I mean, you know, even 10, 15 years ago, there were countries where you had sentries or armed guards standing over fax machines trying to stop information getting into their country. There were dictatorships that thought that if they could control the fax machines and the telephones, you could prevent information seeping into your population, and that's impossible now. And I remember the Chinese premier telling me that the internet would bring democracy to China, because people now can get information from all parts of the world. They can know what's happening to other people. They can combine together in the social media, and therefore the potential for an active citizenship is very strong. It can, of course, aid terrorists who can use cyberspace in which to operate, but it can also aid those people who want to build a fairer and a more secure or sustainable world. So the pressure of individual citizens is going to change the way we have consumer, sort of the way people consume goods. They're going to be blacking of goods that are not acceptable, and people are going to tell people on the media, you don't need governments to take action. People will vote as consumers, but also people are in a position, if they choose, to give $1 each to help Syrian refugees get education, which is one of the things we've been discussing. You could imagine every university student in the world asked to give $1, and you could actually fund the education of Syrian refugees who are out of school at the moment.
I do urge you to take a look at the report when it's available next week, and it may prompt some thinking or ideas along the lines of mass movements that students like you could be involved in. I think why don't we take one more? Okay, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Brett Milan. I'm a student here at NYU DC. Mr. Brown, on June 23rd, assumed you knew this question might be coming. The UK is taking a referendum, colloquially called
I thought you were
Brexit.
going to ask about the American presidential election.
This, I think, is more interesting, actually. The UK is taking a referendum, colloquially called Brexit. So first of all, what are your thoughts on that issue? And secondly, if the UK does vote to leave, how does that have any ramifications on security and cooperation within Europe? So just your thoughts on that. Thank you.
The interesting thing is that everything I've said about an integrated, interconnected world, which suggests that you want to be part of organizations that involve your neighbors. In fact, that John Kennedy speech I mentioned in 1962, when he talked about the Declaration of Interdependence, he proposed there be a more united Europe that would work with a United States of America in the interests of promoting world peace and disarmament and security and an end to poverty and deprivation around the world. So it makes sense of our idea of an integrated and interdependent world that countries who are neighbors of each other should work ever more closely together. And therefore you wouldn't be surprised if I was supporting continued membership of the European Union. It is a difficult question for Britain because some people, you might say, living in the past, tend to think that Britain was a world power, had a relationship with what was called the Commonwealth, a special relationship with the United States of America, and doesn't need to be part of the European continent because it's an island off the mainland of Europe. And so there is an old view of Britain that some people hold that better off independent, standing alone, better off aloof, better off as the fiercely independent nation that stood up to Nazism by standing alone, better off in that way than having cooperation with other people. I was in a television studio a few months ago, and there was one of these people who are called Eurosceptics in Britain, people who don't want to be part of the European Union. And they were very incredibly hostile to everything that was European. And the interviewer was saying to him, "But why are you so hostile? Why do you dislike Europe so much?" And eventually, out of frustration, the man said, "Well, why do you hate them so much? Is it ignorance or is it apathy?" And the guy replied, "I don't know and I don't care."
Well, on that, Gordon, in addition to the breadth of knowledge you have on politics, government, finance, education, the economy, world peace, human rights, you also have the depth of insight and a terrific sense of humor. We're very happy that you could spend some time with us here in DC. We look forward to continuing NYU's relationship with you as a distinguished global leader in residence, and we hope that you've given, I'm pretty sure you have, because you articulated so clearly some of these challenges. I think you've given the audience some great food for thought. Thank you very, very much for being with us.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks,
Thank you.